Homosexuel un jour, homosexuel toujours. Le sujet très sensible de l'homosexualité est au cœur de ce documentaire, plus particulièrement la croyance à l'effet que les personnes homosexuelles naissent et meurent ainsi, et que toute tentative de modifier leur orientation est inutile et risque de leur faire du tort. Est-ce exact? L'homosexualité est-elle fixée pour de bon chez ceux qui ressentent des attraits envers le même sexe?
Mesdames, Messieurs, bonjour. Aujourd'hui, je vous invite à plonger dans l'univers des thérapies qui aident les personnes homosexuelles à migrer vers l'hétérosexualité. C'est un sujet tabou, explosif et empoisonné au point où des journalistes, des professeurs d'université et des élus perdent leur emploi pour en avoir parlé favorablement. En fait, les Canadiens marchent les fesses serrées quand il est question d'homosexualité autour d'eux, constatant les représailles démesurées appliquées à ceux qui disent à voix haute ce que tout le monde pense tout bas. Conséquemment, il n'y a à peu près plus personne qui ose exprimer publiquement un avis sur les pratiques homosexuelles ou les thérapies qui remettent en question l'idéologie obligatoire imposée à la population. Un peu comme cela se passe dans les pays totalitaires. Comment en sommes-nous arrivés là? Ce documentaire donne la parole à une brochette de spécialistes des thérapies pour y répondre. Aucun média de masse de chez nous n'a voulu leur donner la parole jusqu'ici, ce qui en dit long sur l'état du journalisme chez nous. Les images que vous allez voir ont plutôt été tournées dans le cadre d'une enquête indépendante menée depuis 18 ans, souvent par des caméramans amateurs, de façon discrète, afin d'arriver jusqu'à vous avant que le lobby gay ne les censure.
I don't get the opportunity much to tell my own story. It may be more emotional for me today. I remember being about 15 years old, curled over my bed, sobbing and telling God that I was so bad, I did not know what to do. I felt very alone. And I didn't know that God was even hearing me. I felt very lost. The attractions that I had were so strong. They were obsessive for thinking about other boys in sexual ways. I could not stop the thoughts. It was obsessive all day. I would struggled with masturbation 5 or 6 times a day. I was doing that and fantasizing and feeling very lost, certain that I was not going to heaven. And I needed somebody to talk to.
Well, in my life, I didn't long to connect with the female world. I saw the female world as a liability because I grew up in a home where there was domestic violence perpetrated against my mother by my father. And so my dad was an abuser and my mother was a victim. So I identified femaleness or femininity with victimization and weakness. And I had an older brother and a younger sister, and so my older brother is the one I really looked up to. I didn't look up to my father as a role model because he was abusive. And so I looked up to my older brother, so there was a lot of gender confusion in my life.
I grew up in a home that was very fundamentalist. My dad used religion, in my perception, as a way of kind of manipulating. He would have been good in the military. He was very, very by the book. Very, very cold emotionally. I could not relate to him. He was interested in things I had no interest in. We sort of butted heads personality-wise. There was no connection. He was not terribly abusive. There were times where he did smack me a few times, and he would spank me in anger, which I suppose was not very healthy. But enough so that I was afraid of him. I was distanced from him. He was rather cold emotionally, and I could not connect.
I started to adopt very masculine traits early on, like even toddlerhood and certainly elementary school and on up. But it started very young where people often mistook me for a boy in public. And so I was often called sir, son, and young man.
As I grew, those longings for a father figure just never went away, constantly needing a father figure, a dad. I'd have 1 or 2 church leaders reach out to me, and I was just so starved for that. they would call, and I was just hanging on having them help me and work with me. But you know, they tried, but I don't know that they were always understood how deeply I needed some of that.
Tennis was the sport that I learned first and loved the most. And I would go into the locker room at the tennis club where my family had a membership, and this is as a young girl. And the women would say, "What are you doing in here?" And I would say, "I'm a girl." And they'd say, "Are you sure?" And I remember thinking, I only know one way to prove it. And so I just let it go. I just thought, I'm not doing that.
I tried out for the wrestling team in junior high, and I weighed in, I think, at 76 pounds. I was the smallest. I hadn't started puberty, really, and so I'm in there, and I don't know how much of you know about wrestling, any of you, but you know, they line you up in your boxer shorts, and they weigh you in, and I remember getting lined up to weigh in, and I'm the skinniest. I'm like a rail, and all these other boys that I perceived as being more muscular and had body hair, and so I was comparing myself. I felt different than them. I didn't compare to, I wasn't as good as they are. It was very, very difficult emotionally.
When we look at our clients, these are people, mostly men, who as little boys were shut down. They were hurt and rejected by male figures. They were typically in intimate but frustrating relationships with their mothers. And so they, because of their family dynamic, did not have the opportunity to internalize their masculinity. And they became what we call good little boys. Good little boy is don't offend anybody, don't get anybody angry with you, and there's a shutdown mode. Closed, self-protective, fearful, guarded, timid, shy. That's what they live in, okay? And the therapy is to bring them out, to be assertive, to be clear, to be courageous, to identify their feelings, to speak their feelings. My professional commitment is developing the most effective therapy to help men overcome their homosexuality.
I'll never forget at one moment being weighed in with the team, and I was like 2 ounces over my weight class. And the moment of awakening where the coach says, you know, your underwear is 2 ounces. So I'm at the front of the line, all these boys behind me, because it's lightest class to heaviest class. And so I'm asked to drop my boxer shorts and weigh in, and I was still a half an ounce over. So he had me go to the restroom to try and dump some weight and come back, and I was still like a 1/4 ounce over, and the humiliation I felt of feeling like I'm being paraded around, not as good as the other boys, was absolutely stifling to me.
As I got a little older, my parents were divorced when I was in 5th grade, and then my younger sister and I were sent away to live with relatives. And I was in 7th grade when we were sent off to live with my aunt and uncle and my cousins. And there I was sexually abused by an older male cousin.
There are actually 4 common reasons why people seek change-allowing therapy. Some identified as LGBT, they had LGBT experiences, but they, in the end, didn't find it fulfilling. So they want to change. Some people are married. There are many who are attracted to both sexes. They're married to an person of the opposite sex because they want to be, and they love their spouse and they love their children. They want to protect their marriage and their family and be able to go on being full-time moms and dads. So they want this therapy. Then there are some who feel that their sexual attraction was forced on them by childhood sexual abuse. They want trauma treatment that will also deal with the links between their trauma and their same-sex attraction behavior to relieve them of it. And they have a right to heal. And there are those who want to live according to their faith, and their wishes and their beliefs should be respected.
And so by 12 years old, I had only ever seen men treat women as the victim of their abuse or the object of their lust. And so when I was sexually abused, one of the conclusions in that experience was, if this is what it means for a man to find me attractive, I don't want to be attractive. because all they do is they take from you. Because they rob me of my dignity.
So it created a fear for me of being in the locker room, of doing sports. I tried church basketball. They'd put me in, and then we'd lose, and we'd get worse and worse. So they'd pull me out, put the other boys in, and then we'd gain the points back. So they'd put me back in. We'd start losing, so they'd pull me out. You know, that experience was just, I was tired of having those experiences. And then the rejection, the last one picked, was very tiring. So by high school, I was feeling very inadequate, feeling inferior. I didn't feel like I had buddies. I longed for a best friend, somebody I could tell my secrets to, talk to, a buddy that would walk with me in my faith, help me, be there for me. Never really attained that.
However minuscule amount of femininity I had up to that point, I wanted to even conceal even more out of a desire for self-protection. So even just hearing that much of my story, I hope you can see that absolutely it's not genetic. That there's some serious factors going on that's going to point me down a road. And I will say in my work in helping men and women walk free from homosexuality or from unwanted same-sex attractions, that in my work and with women, what I have seen, and this is true in my own life, is that lesbians are often trying to protect against further hurt from a man.
I was starved for touch. I was either getting a hit from my dad or nothing. My mother was affectionate with me, but I wanted it from my dad, from a man. I wanted buddies. I'd watch the boys at school hugging on each other, and it just created an ache inside me. I knew it was non-sexual, but I didn't know how to get it. I didn't have those kind of buddies that would provide that for me. I developed a lot of misperceptions about myself. Feeling that these longings must mean I'm gay. The sexual feelings must mean I'm gay. A lot of misperceptions that made it worse.
L'analyse de John et Christine les amène à conclure qu'ils ne sont pas nés homosexuels. Ils comprennent plutôt que des événements précis survenus durant leur enfance sont à l'origine des attraits envers le même sexe qui ont émergé à leur adolescence. Ils se tournent vers une thérapie non pas pour guérir leur homosexualité, mais pour diminuer l'impact que ces événements du passé continuent d'avoir dans leur vie actuelle. Lorsque l'influence de ces événements traumatiques se dissipe avec l'aide d'un thérapeute compétent, leurs attraits envers le même sexe s'estompent et se substituent progressivement par des attraits envers l'autre sexe. Cette explication sur le processus thérapeutique m'a été donnée pour la première fois par les spécialistes des thérapies. Qui sont-ils au juste? À la base, ce sont des thérapeutes qui ont développé des protocoles ajustés à cette clientèle, qui l'enseignent à leurs confrères et qui offrent leur aide dans leur pratique clinique. Puis il y a les chercheurs qui ont réalisé des études scientifiques sur cette clientèle afin de valider si les thérapies sont inoffensives ou leur font du tort. Permettez-moi de vous présenter ceux que ce documentaire vous fera entendre.
D'abord, il y a le Dr Joseph Nicolosi, psychologue, l'un des 3 cofondateurs de la National Association for the Research and Therapy of Homosexuality et en fut le président durant plusieurs années. La Dr Laura Hines, quant à elle, est psychologue et a travaillé en cabinet durant 40 ans en Californie. Elle révise des recherches et prononce des conférences sur l'orientation et l'identité sexuelle au niveau international. Le Dr Nicholas Cumming, psychologue, a été président de l'American Psychological Association de 1979 à 1980. Le Dr Stanton Jones, doyen du département de l'école doctorale et professeur de psychologie à l'université Wheaton, est l'auteur d'une étude publiée en 2007 portant sur la migration de l'orientation sexuelle à travers l'accompagnement religieux. Le Dr A. Dean Bird, psychologue, fut professeur distingué à l'école de médecine de l'université de l'Utah. Il fut co-auteur de 2 études sur l'efficacité des thérapies d'exploration de la fluidité sexuelle. La Dr Julie Hamilton, psychologue et ancienne présidente de North, a produit une vidéo portant sur les racines de l'homosexualité qui s'intitule Homosexuality 101. Le Dr Christopher Rosick, ancien président de North, est psychologue et directeur de la recherche au Link Care Center de Fresno en Californie. La Dr Carolyn Pila, ancienne présidente de l'Alliance, est psychologue et directrice du département des sciences du comportement et des sciences sociales de la Arizona Christian University. Le Dr Joseph Berger est membre distingué de l'American Psychiatric Association et du Collège royal des médecins et chirurgiens du Canada. Le Dr Benjamin Kaufman, médecin, est l'un des 3 cofondateurs de North. Enfin, Christopher Doyle est psychothérapeute et directeur de l'Institute for Healthy Families. Il est le cofondateur de la National Task Force for Therapy Equality.
So by the time I was in high school, my emotional needs for affection from a mentor, affirmation about my masculinity, it was all getting sexualized. It was so intense. My emotional preoccupation around jealousy, I felt jealous of the other boys. I was envious of them. I was filled with daydreams. What it would be like to have a best friend, and I'd hear the boys talking about what they did together in the campouts, and boy, I wanted to be doing what they were doing and didn't feel like I could. Or my better friends were girls. It was easier to relate to the girls. I could feel close to the girls. I had some guy friends, but I was closer to the girls.
We see this over and over again. These poor clients come in and think they have unique stories. They think it's unique because the culture is not talking about it. There's no way to get feedback. Am I the only one in the world? They come into our clinic and they discover, no, you're not the only one in the world. This is a typical pattern. And the mental health associations are doing not only an injustice, they are doing a violence because they are not letting this information be known.
I was very sensitive. And that made it more intense. My life experiences were intense. My sensitivity made things more intense for me.
Moving forward, I got involved in my first homosexual relationship when I was in high school. And I was like finally, feeling love and felt like, okay, this is who I am. And so I was settling into that. I mean, I know I was headed for, I would have made a wonderful gay activist had God not intervened, let me tell you, because I had enough anger in me.
So by the time I was 18, I was contemplating my choices. I remember my bishop, church I was going to at the time, was very concerned because I was talking to him about these choices of either running off, running away somewhere, or killing myself. It didn't seem like a very productive option there. I didn't really want to kill myself, but I didn't really see too many options. I didn't know how I'd live on my own. So finally, on my bishop's pushing, I told my parents.
I started out in high school, and I'm going to jump to several years later as a young adult in my last relationship with a married woman, which I'm not proud of that.
It was a horrifying experience. About had a panic attack on the side of the bed as I told my parents. My father's response was, "No, you're not. That's disgusting. Are you kidding? Do you know what boys do when they have those kind of feelings?" It was a terrible experience and pretty much shut me down. My mother just sat and sobbed, but she did want to help and fortunately started to help me find some counselors.
Avec le soutien de ses parents, John, qui a 18 ans et qui est en mesure de prendre ses propres décisions, va rencontrer pour la première fois un thérapeute. Il aura l'occasion en thérapie de lui confier le manque de connexion émotionnelle répété avec son père dont il souffre depuis son enfance et la piètre image qu'il trimballe de sa masculinité à cause de la perception négative qu'il a de son corps, faisant suite à certains traumatismes. Perd-il son temps et son argent? Si l'on se fie au discours du lobby gay, John vient de prendre une décision complètement insensée, car il ne pourra jamais changer son orientation sexuelle, puisqu'au cœur de son être, dans sa propre biologie, se trouve un gène gay qui verrouille la direction de son orientation sexuelle à jamais vers l'homosexualité. Les journalistes perspicaces relèveront toutefois qu'aucune référence scientifique n'est jamais fournie par le lobby pour appuyer cette affirmation, et pour cause. Les études sur les jumeaux de King et McDonald, les recherches scientifiques récentes de Diamond, Seville Williams, Bailey et Lohman, ainsi que l'Ordre des psychologues d'Amérique déboutent complètement cette théorie du siècle dernier pour confirmer ce que plusieurs constatent en regardant autour d'eux. à savoir que la sexualité humaine peut fluctuer au cours de la vie d'une personne, pouvant migrer par exemple de l'hétérosexualité qui se trouve à une extrémité du spectre vers la bisexualité ou vers l'homosexualité qui se trouve à l'autre extrémité, et vice-versa, sans même avoir à recourir à une thérapie. C'est le concept de fluidité sexuelle naturelle.
Sexuality is very fluid. In the course of a person's lifetime, they can swing back and forth between homosexual, heterosexual, back again. We know that the adolescents can be more engaged in the homosexual activity and then move on, and others in midlife will become homosexual. So there's a fluidity in sexuality.
In regards to sexual attraction fluidity, there is a lot of research that's been done over the past few decades. Lisa Diamond is the spearhead for most of that research. And she started off just looking at women and then expanded it to men to see what happens with people's sexual attraction fluidity over a lifetime.
They consider her a leading expert in sexual orientation change through life experience. Diamond followed 79 non-heterosexual women over 10 years and found social influences on same-sex sexuality. She said the most surprising finding was that bisexual and unlabeled women pursued progressively more sexual contact with men than did women over the 10 years of the study. Two bisexual women with the exact same degree of same-sex attraction in 1995 often made very different choices 10 years later. Whereas one would have settled with a woman, the other would have ended up with a man. It was the case even for women who had started out strongly attracted to women, that they could end up finding themselves fantasizing less often about women and seeking out fewer opportunities to date female partners and become happily married to a man.
And so in that season of my life is when I was evangelized by a group of, it's a really bizarre situation. It was a group of Baptist women, and I found myself on a Southern Baptist softball team. So don't ask me what a lesbian was doing playing softball with Baptists. It was really my love of sports that got me there, but it was absolutely a divine conspiracy. Okay. And so that's what got me around a group of Christians on a regular basis. And there were some that knew, because I looked the part. I was still very masculine. I was still being called Sir, Son, Young Man. I was the runner-up to the Miss Butch America pageant. You guys are like, is there really one? So, poor thing, I scared the poor lady. Anyway, that is some humor to lighten this, some levity. Yes?
I will say that I went to 4 different counselors from that point forward, none of which were very productive or helpful to me. No, the first therapist I went to was a very, what's the right word? He was very popular in the religious community I was a part of at the time, and so everybody sent their kids to this counselor. So what he did really was try and have me read the scriptures a lot and pray and, give me a lot of spiritual stories. So I don't think in that regard maybe that was helpful because, it kept my faith going a bit. But it did absolutely nothing. In fact, my attractions were just getting stronger all the time. It wasn't helping that. So that was discouraging. I found out years later, here's an interesting tidbit. I went to him when I was becoming a counselor to get some advice from him. And he pulled out a whole file of information he had from Exodus and Evergreen and said, they sent me this stuff when you were a kid, but I never really believed it, and I never wanted to approach it with you. I wanted to get up and wring his neck. It would have been life-changing for me.
Many therapists say, oh, no, you can't go on that direction. You cannot explore your sexual attraction fluidity because that just can't be done. You'll be harmed. So if you're asking for help with that and they're saying, nope, I'm not going to do it, you can't do that, you have to go my way and embrace your sexual attraction as your primary core identity. And I know that's an exaggeration perhaps. I don't know if people say that, but that's basically the message that I received from some of my clients that came to me that they had heard from previous therapists. It's like there was no hope. There was no hope. And so their well-being actually plummeted. And some of them had actually, for the first time, experienced some suicidality as a result of the lack of support for their autonomy and self-determination.
They didn't really know what to do with me, to be honest, and I didn't realize that their dilemma. But and the main dilemma was this was a church team, and I didn't actually know the difference between sports and church sports. And so, like, I only know sports, and the goal is to win. That's the only goal. And in church sports, it's like, if we win, glory to God. If we lose, glory to God. And I was like, no, I'm not cool with that. And so I was the one in the outfield throwing my glove and swearing when the ball got past the shortstop. So the Baptist women are like horrified because, you know, on my jersey it says, say yes to Jesus. And I'm calling out obscenities. And so they complained to my coach, as you do. We call it prayer request. Y'all know what I'm talking about. As long as your head is bowed when you say it, it's not gossip, okay? And so they complained, and he said, because they were like, Coach, she's cussing the outfield. He said, you see that girl? You pray for that girl. So they did. They were praying for me. And this went on for like a year and a half.
You know, and the other counselors didn't have any information. They didn't know. And the fourth one was just politically incorrect enough to be willing to read Jeff Conrad's book and say, yeah, let's read it together. Let's talk about it. See what applies to you.
John travaille avec différents thérapeutes qui lui font perdre à la fois son temps et son argent, car il ne fait l'expérience d'aucune réduction de ses attraits homosexuels. Au contraire, ils augmentent. Les thérapeutes qu'il consulte sont-ils des charlatans? John décrit ses sessions avec eux en termes de lecture biblique, de prière et d'analyse d'histoire spirituelle. On peut difficilement assimiler ces éléments à autre chose que de l'accompagnement spirituel. Or, de l'accompagnement spirituel, ce n'est pas de la thérapie. Ces thérapeutes étaient sans doute remplis de bonnes intentions, mais à l'évidence, ils n'avaient jamais reçu de formation sur la bonne manière d'accompagner ce type de clients. Ils étaient donc incompétents. Il faut dire qu'à cette époque, aucune institution académique ou professionnelle n'offrait une telle formation aux thérapeutes. Ces derniers devaient plutôt se former par eux-mêmes, soit en consultant un confrère ou en étudiant des cas cliniques documentés qui s'étaient conclus par un succès.
Il est intéressant ici de faire une analogie avec les régimes minceurs. Durant les années d'après-guerre, dans un contexte d'abondance alimentaire relativement nouveau, l'Amérique a vu naître la restauration rapide, avec comme conséquence insoupçonnée la hausse phénoménale du taux d'obésité. À cette époque, aucun cours de nutrition ou de spécialisation en diététique n'existait dans les universités, le phénomène étant trop nouveau et n'ayant pas été étudié convenablement. Lorsque des personnes obèses se sont mises à cogner à la porte de médecins pour obtenir de l'aide, la plupart n'étaient équipés que de leur bonne volonté et de présupposés. Ils ont alors proposé des régimes minceurs inadéquats, inefficaces, dangereux et parfois même inhumains. Heureusement, des années de recherche menées auprès de cette clientèle ont débouché sur le développement de régimes minceurs éprouvés, efficaces, sécuritaires et qui sont maintenant enseignés dans un grand nombre d'universités.
Que serait-il arrivé si, au lieu de favoriser la recherche, les législateurs avaient banni les régimes minceurs sur la base que des charlatans les utilisent pour profiter de personnes obèses dont on met la santé en danger? Il est clair que la bonne solution n'était pas de les interdire, ni de mettre la santé des gens en danger, ni de détruire la réputation des médecins, mais d'évaluer scientifiquement l'efficacité de différents régimes afin d'identifier ceux qui ont le meilleur taux de succès, de forcer les médecins voulant aider cette clientèle à se faire former, puis de multiplier les lieux où l'on peut recevoir cette formation afin de multiplier le nombre de ceux qui ont la compétence d'aider. Bannir les régimes minceurs tout en aidant les personnes obèses à s'accepter telles qu'elles sont aurait complètement raté la cible. La même logique doit s'appliquer aux thérapies de migration.
La période nébuleuse des thérapies comportementales et d'aversion qui soulèvent des questions éthiques et des psychanalyses qui, elles, requièrent un nombre d'années exagéré, se termine avec la fin des années 70. Les années 80 et 90 voient apparaître une nouvelle gamme de modalités thérapeutiques découlant des avancées en neurologie, dont certaines, appliquées aux personnes désirant migrer vers l'hétérosexualité, ont l'avantage d'augmenter significativement le taux de succès des thérapies tout en accélérant la durée du traitement. C'est l'époque où les premières cliniques de thérapeutes dédiées exclusivement aux personnes homosexuelles font leur apparition. Entre-temps, le lobby gay s'infiltre progressivement dans les médias, les institutions de santé mentale, dans le gouvernement et ailleurs, travaillant d'arrache-pied à convaincre que l'homosexualité est innée et n'a pas à être traitée. Voyant les thérapies gagner en efficacité et se répandre en Occident, le lobby gay s'engage dans une course contre la montre pour que les ordres les bannissent, pour discréditer tout thérapeute qui les pratique, pour qu'aucune étude sur le sujet ne reçoive de subventions et pour qu'elle ne soit enseignée nulle part avant qu'il ne soit trop tard.
Gay activists have done many studies of opinion, public opinion, the formation and the creation and the manipulation of public opinion. And they have found repeatedly that if you can convince the population, the general population, that homosexuals are choosing that, then there is less empathy, less sympathy for this population. But if you can convince the general population that these people are gay because they have no choice, because there is a gay gene, then there's a tendency to be more tolerant and more accepting. So this notion of the gay gene has to be promoted, the biological origins that are beyond the individual's choice. But there is much more evidence showing that people can change.
But the fourth counselor I went to, thank goodness, had a couple books. And he suggested I go to a conference by Exodus. Went to the conference, and I listened to Jeff Conrad. And it was so frustrating for me at that conference hearing his story and listening to people in the audience heckle him. Because I'd hear his story and I'd think, oh, that's me. Oh, yeah, I can relate to that. Oh, I can relate to that. And then somebody would make a stupid comment. I'm sure he was frustrated. There were a lot of picketers. Well, at least that's my memory. There were a lot of picketers at that one. And he went out into the hall, and I went out into the hall, and I was so lost. And I remember him, he looked discouraged. And I went over and looked at him, and I couldn't get anything out. And I just started to cry. And he came over and he just hugged me. And he said, it's okay. He says, there's answers. You can do this. You can get over this. The feelings can change. They can go away. But you got a lot of wounds, and you got a lot of needs. You have to learn how to take care of those. That was the beginning of my recovery.
And so I became a Christian, and it's not like God waved a magic wand over me in the immortal words of Cy Rogers and said, 1, 2, 3, now you're free, go be straight, date, and mate. That's not what happened when I became a Christian. My eternal destiny changed, and then now I was faced with a dilemma. I was incongruent now with my faith, and incongruent living is not sustainable. So I had a conflict. How do I not be gay anymore?
1990, started working on my needs, healing some of the wounds. I started to gain a picture of what my deficits were, my needs were. Man, I needed mentors. I needed buddies. I needed to feel masculine. I needed to stop hating my body. So I started engaging goals, working on some things, and went to college, lived with roommates, fantastic experience. Started bonding in ways I hadn't bonded before. I had this great roommate that he'd take me, I remember telling him, I don't know how to play football, and you want to go to the football games. I don't even know what they're doing. I don't know what they're talking about. It's stupid. I don't even like the game. He says, let's go play. And so he took me down to the field at night, and we tackled a goalpost and some other ridiculous activities. But being with him, having him want to help me and teaching me the game was very healing for me. I don't know that the tackle portion was, but the learning portion was. I remember coming home at night. I was working late at a gas station because I was trying to learn how to do some mechanical things, and I'd be plastered on the bed. I was so tired, and I'd wake up in the morning, and there were nights where he had helped me take off my greasy shirt and get into bed and kind of tuck me in. I'd never had that sort of affection from a buddy before. I remember a roommate that was leaving for Christmas break, and he just hugged me. That's the first time I'd ever been hugged by a guy before. And he says, man, I love you. And I remember sobbing. I hadn't heard that before. All these needs and deficits, which I could see later, I'd been sexualizing. I was so hungry for those kinds of things that I'd been sexualizing legitimate emotional needs and wounds.
So it was a process. Thankfully, I heard about ministries that help people like myself. I heard a guy named Cy Rogers on the radio shortly after I became a Christian, and he's got a phenomenal testimony. And so I was very encouraged by that and hope, filled with hope from that. And so I started my journey out of homosexuality. I began to attend a support group in my hometown of Tampa, Florida. And in fact, a gentleman here was in group with me 24 years ago. Woohoo! It's called Straight Ahead, and pun intended. And so that is where I started to understand the roots of my homosexuality, which I've already shared with you in story form. Having a breakdown in the relationship with the same-sex parent, having been sexually abused, gender confusion, all of that contributed to the perfect storm in my life to point me down a road. Now where I chose homosexuality, because I didn't choose the feelings and the attractions, I chose to act on them. But feeling homosexually oriented, I also felt like I had no choice.
Worked on healing my needs. As time went on, it was not a fast fix, and that's something important to know. For me, it took me some time. It took me a few years. But the feelings would diminish. You know, and I would notice as I would go out with guys, I wasn't sexually attracted. The more I got the needs met, those attractions were going down. I didn't have to focus on girls. I didn't have to focus on dating. I didn't have to force myself to think about having sex with somebody, or with a girl. I just had to focus on healing the emotional needs. And as I did that, the sexual side of it just would diminish. It would go down. When I'd get hugged on by guys, or my roommates helping me learn football, the feelings are diminishing.
Look, reparative therapy is not just simply a focus on diminishing same-sex attraction. That is the accusation of reparative therapy. Gays and other people who don't know what reparative therapy is think that the client comes in and we hit them over the head with a bat until they give up their homosexuality and then they're cured. No, it doesn't work that way at all, okay? We deal with past trauma. We deal with male friendships. We deal with body image. We deal with assertion. We deal with facing the reality of the fact that you did not get what you needed from your childhood, whether it be mother, father, family dynamic, or whatever. We deal with identity. We deal with self-esteem. We deal with your sense of yourself in relationship to others. You're not a little boy among women. You're not a little boy among men. You're a man among men. So there's a complete transformation of identity.
And then the church is where I built healthy same-sex friendships, which was a monumental challenge. And you can talk to any person coming out of homosexuality, and that is a monumental challenge. Because so often we feel inferior or inadequate in our gender.
The biggest epiphany for me was to realize that my same-sex attraction didn't define me. It was just a symptom of all these other emotional needs, legitimate needs.
What I needed was non-sexual intimacy. So for me to be isolated, I wasn't going to get intimacy. You can't get intimacy if you're isolated. And so I needed to press through my fear of rejection. And so as I got to know people, and not everybody, but on an individual basis, I got to share what I was dealing with, and I felt supported and loved, and that just helped encourage me. And so I was developing healthy same-sex friendships, and I will tell you that as I did this, my sexual attractions for women naturally diminished. Because I got what I was looking for all along: love, intimacy, connection.
I learned over time that I had to immediately start acknowledging, whenever I was attracted to a guy, I had to acknowledge, okay, I'm having a same-sex attraction, and there's a message underneath it. I had to acknowledge that. When I got good at that, then I would move to the I, which is identify. Now I need to identify what is the message. What is that message? And I got good at that after a while too. You know, if I see this very attractive guy, he's very cut, and I immediately was able to identify there's a message in there. I don't feel like I'm as good as him. I'm very jealous of that. I don't have the muscles he has. Or I'm getting attracted to these guys who are all bantering together and hugging on each other down the hall at school. And I'm realizing I'm missing that. I need that. So when I identified the need, that took me to M, which was move. I had to move into the message. I had to do something. I had to get out there. If I was jealous because of him, I had to go work out. Like the way I look, I had to get into that. You can tell I'm, at this point, very buff, and I got, to liking the way I looked. Or I had to move into buddies. If I was lonely, I had to get into some buddies and move towards the message that was.
Malgré tous les obstacles que John rencontre sur son chemin, les prédictions du lobby gay qu'il ne sera jamais libéré de ses attraits homosexuels, les thérapeutes diplômés sans formation adéquate pour l'accompagner, les manifestants à la conférence de Jeff Conrad tentant de le dissuader, John va finalement trouver une personne compétente qui va l'aider à mettre le doigt sur ce qui lui arrive, à résoudre les traumatismes de son enfance et à intégrer en lui les outils nécessaires pour qu'il n'ait plus besoin d'un thérapeute pour poursuivre son cheminement. John doit-il être considéré comme une exception à la règle? C'est-à-dire, est-il aussi difficile d'être libéré de ses attraits envers le même sexe que de gagner à la loterie?
There's over a century of research published including by American Psychological Association members in the peer-reviewed journals of the American Psychological Association. It shows that when therapy is done right, it is effective.
If you take all the studies, the Spitzer study, you take the Jones and Yarhouse study, you take the studies that are historical, they simply arrive at one conclusion. This is the conclusion that homosexuality is not invariably fixed in all people, that some people can and do change.
Robert Spitzer did a study of about 200 individuals who came out of homosexuality and made a heterosexual adjustment. Robert Spitzer formulated the study, he interviewed the people, and he had a great deal of opposition in trying to publish his data. Now, what's significant about Robert Spitzer is that he was the man who made the 1973 decision. He was ahead of the nomenclature. The nomenclature is the book of diagnostic categories. He was the one who determined whether or not something was considered a disorder or not a disorder. So it was Robert Spitzer who said in 1973, let's not consider homosexuality a disorder. And while he does not consider it a disorder, he still believes that people can change.
Spitzer was approached in the late 1990s because there was the move then within psychiatry as well. The American Psychiatric Association was being lobbied to ban therapy. Spitzer essentially said, I'm not political, I'm a research scientist and so on. We had some sort of ideas some years ago. If they should be changed, I'm willing to explore it. And he did what seems to be a very solid research study in which essentially he concluded that the results indeed were pretty good. A lot of people who had identified themselves as homosexual had become comfortably heterosexual after psychotherapy treatment.
There was not simply behavior or simply attraction, but in core features of homosexuality. Now, this was not a study to determine how many people could change, but whether or not it was correct, the statement from the national organizations that no one could change. And he determined that that was not correct.
He could be hardly accused of being a slacker as a researcher, right? And he wasn't coming at it from he didn't have a religious axe to grind, so to speak, on this. And he was just a curious scientist.
This report that it came from a man like Robert Spitzer was very, very significant, very threatening to the gay activists, because until then, Robert Spitzer was their great hero, and they consider him now a traitor.
Dr. Drescher, who's one of the leading anti-therapy activists in the States. He is the editor of a journal called the Journal of Gay and Lesbian Psychotherapy, and he devoted a whole issue to trying to trash Spitzer's results, which I think I read a couple of the articles, I didn't read them all, but they didn't seem to me to have any scientific validity whatsoever. They were really mostly name-calling.
Now, Dr. Spitzer was criticized for his study, and all the studies are somewhat imperfect. But Dr. Hirschberger reanalyzed the research, which was reported in the archives of sexual behavior, and he did something that's called a Gutman analysis, where he reanalyzed Dr. Spitzer's study. And his conclusion was that the study did indeed demonstrate that some people can and do change. When you evaluate studies and to determine, which study is correct among these sorts of studies, number one, you need to look at the study itself, the methodology. But you also need to look at the reputation of the scientist who's doing the study. I can tell you there is not a researcher that has more credibility than Dr. Robert Spitzer or Dr. Scott Hirschberger. They're immaculate researchers. And their conclusion is that some people can and do change.
And things sort of quietened down for a number of years. And then about, a year or two ago or so, a young Californian went very vocal and very public, claiming that he had been harmed by a treatment, and he confronted Spitzer evidently directly. He went to see Spitzer, who is now a man in his 80s and evidently not very well, and somewhere or other he convinced Spitzer that he had been harmed, and he got some sort of apology out of Spitzer.
Dans les jours qui suivent la publication de son étude, le Dr Robert Spitzer va goûter amèrement à la police de la pensée qu'exerce le lobby gay sur tout individu ou organisation qui s'oppose à son programme d'endoctrinement idéologique. Des confrères gays radicalement militants vont attaquer sa réputation dans des revues de psychiatrie. Des journalistes pro-gays vont écrire des articles qui le discréditent. Des militants gays vont l'appeler pour lui faire des reproches et lui transmettre des centaines de courriels de haine durant le reste de ses jours, pour lui faire payer d'avoir osé remettre en question le discours officiel. You don't think like me, then you're my enemy. C'est le modus operandi du lobby gay qui veille à mettre hors d'état de nuire, ou dit autrement, qui s'assure de tuer tout messager qui annonce autre chose que la ligne du parti du lobby. Cela vous rappelle-t-il les pays où les droits humains sont violés?
Il est difficile de constater la tyrannie actuelle du lobby gay envers ses opposants sans la mettre en dialogue avec son discours d'il y a 50 ans, lorsqu'il demandait aux autorités et à la population de cesser de persécuter ses membres simplement parce qu'ils sont différents, de faire preuve d'ouverture et de tolérance envers la diversité des orientations sexuelles et de créer un climat propice à l'écoute et au respect mutuel. Celui qui jadis était la victime est clairement devenu l'agresseur lorsqu'on constate le malheur que le lobby fait vivre à toute personne qui ose diffuser ce que dit la science sur les thérapies. Rendu à la fin de sa vie, après avoir été harcelé et harassé de cette manière durant 9 ans, devenu lourdement diminué par la maladie de Parkinson et par son âge avancé, Spitzer va finir par plier l'échine. Et, comme l'avait fait Galilée 380 ans avant lui, va s'excuser auprès des personnes homosexuelles d'avoir publié une recherche qui dit des mensonges, soulevant la possibilité que les 200 participants qu'il a lui-même interviewés lui aient tous menti. Il décède quelques mois plus tard sans que The Archives of Sexual Behavior n'accepte de rétracter son étude.
You know the story, he goes under such pressure. That I think he eventually wanted to reinterpret his study. There's a lot of reasons for that, I think, going on, but that was towards the end of his life. I guess his big reversal was that, well, we can't be sure, because this was self-report. Well, and it's interesting about that, if that's the criteria, that if it's self-report research and you have to question it, then, 90% of psychological research has to be questioned and thrown out, right? If you can't take people's responses at some level of face value, if everybody's lying to you, then you have to throw a lot of the research out across the board of psychology.
Spitzer a eu un impact majeur dans la communauté scientifique, malgré le fait que sa méthodologie n'en faisait pas une étude à standard très élevé. Celle de Stanton Jones et Mark Yarhouse qui suit vient corriger cette lacune.
what is said over and over and over again is that there's no valid scientific research. Now, I think that that's wrong. There is scientific research, but it's not great, rigorous scientific research. And the people who are the critics, they keep coming back time and time again that there's not a study that's longitudinal, there's not a study that's prospective. Those are the two most important variables. Well, now there is.
If you're looking at whether an intervention of whatever you're looking at, if you're looking to see whether an intervention makes a difference, if it's actually can be imply causality, you need a prospective study.
Some people assume that I must be driven by hatred of gay people or that I've got someone in my family that I'm worried about. It's nothing like that. My interest was largely academic, intellectual. I knew some of the previous scientific literature that was out of the psychoanalytic tradition and other therapeutic traditions where there were studies that were reporting people had changed, and it struck me as very odd that these studies were just being dismissed on the basis of one or two people coming forward and saying, well, I was in that study and I didn't really change.
There is really a rich psychoanalytic tradition of understanding the cause and treatment of homosexuality, but that whole body of literature from the 1920s all the way up to about the 1970s have been buried politically. But when I go back to the early literature, I see that they see what we see today.
It struck me that we wouldn't act that way for a study of alcoholism. If you did a study and reported that a third of the people were sober, and then somebody came forward and said, well, I was one of those people and I wasn't really sober, we wouldn't throw out the whole study on that basis, but that's precisely what was happening in this area. I actually put together a grant proposal and I sought funding from a number of foundations and met with complete failure in getting the grant funded. Non-religious foundations, no one would touch it. They said, yes, you're right, this is an interesting subject and it's too controversial and we won't touch it. And it was almost 6 or 7 years after that I got a call from the director of Exodus.
About 400,000 people contact our organization every single year, and what we identify in those who call is there are some very common themes. One of them is sexual abuse. 85% of the men and women who contact us for help would say that they have a history of sexual abuse prior to the age of 12.
And I thought about it, and I realized that the study would be considered as less valid if it was funded by Exodus in the same way that cancer research funded by the tobacco companies. So realizing that, I said to the Exodus people, we will agree to accept the money for this study from you on one primary condition, that is that you've got to understand, we're not doing this to make Exodus look good. We're doing this because we want to ask the important scientific question whether there's anything real happening here or not. And if it turns out that lots of your people are getting better, you can be happy about that and we'll publish it. But if it turns out that zero, if everybody runs away from this and nobody gets better, we're going to report that too. And they kind of gulped and said, okay.
But it wasn't looking at therapy per se, it was looking at more religiously mediated kinds of change. But it did suggest that change does occur.
Well, in 2011, just this year, last month in October, they published in the Journal of Sex and Marital Therapy, they published their follow-up results to that 3-year study. So now it's been 7 years, and they went back and looked at these guys again and found that these people, these participants, are maintaining their success 7 years later.
L'étude de Jones et Earhouse ainsi que celle de Spitzer s'ajoute à une longue liste de recherches et cas d'études ayant été menées sur 125 ans d'histoire, qui, considérées dans leur ensemble, convergent vers une conclusion incontournable. Il est bel et bien possible de migrer de l'homosexualité vers l'hétérosexualité. Or, ce portrait d'ensemble contrecarre directement les efforts du lobby gay visant à convaincre que l'homosexualité est innée et inaltérable. Si rien n'est fait, le lobby se met à craindre que les thérapies gagnent en popularité et que la bataille pour faire accepter l'homosexualité comme un droit de la personne soit perdue. L'Association des psychologues d'Amérique, qui compte désormais une aile LGBT, baptisée la Division 44, réagit en formant rapidement un groupe de travail à qui l'on donne le mandat officiel d'évaluer les études afin d'établir si les thérapies de migration sont bel et bien efficaces. La composition du comité est confiée à la docteure Judith Glassgold. Rapidement, les docteurs Stanton Jones, Mark Yarhouse, Joseph Nicolosi et Dean Bird, qui sont des sommités dans le développement de ces thérapies et des chercheurs qui ont étudié leur efficacité, sont mis en nomination pour enrichir le groupe de travail de leur expertise. Lors du dévoilement des membres, tous, sans exception, ont été écartés du projet.
Le comité sera plutôt composé de Judith Glassgold, psychologue lesbienne, membre du comité de direction du Journal of Gay and Lesbian Psychotherapy et ancienne présidente de la Division 44. Jack Drescher, psychiatre et militant pro-gay reconnu, collaborateur du Journal of Gay and Lesbian Psychotherapy et l'un des opposants les plus virulents à la thérapie de migration. Lee Backstead, psychologue gay conseillant les clients d'orientation LGBT provenant de différentes traditions religieuses. Beverly Green, psychologue lesbienne, cofondatrice de la Division 44 de l'APA. Robin Lynn Miller, psychologue de la communauté bisexuelle, a travaillé pour le Gay Men's Health Crisis à New York et a écrit dans des publications gays. Roger Worthington, qui n'est pas homosexuel, lauréat du 2001 Catalyst Award pour son implication à faire connaître publiquement et à répétition des réalités LGBT. Et finalement, Clinton Anderson, psychologue gay, officier du bureau de l'APA en ce qui concerne l'homosexualité, le lesbianisme et la bisexualité.
The task force that did the research, the task force that did the gathering of this data was a task force composed of gay activists. Not only were they gay, but they were gay activists in almost all cases.
Of course, these procedures lead to a biased response. And position statements of the American Psychological Association do not represent a consensus of all professional therapists and researchers. They represent a consensus of those who share one particular worldview.
The problem is that people think that the American Psychological Association, the American Psychiatric Association, these are scientific organizations, and if it has 12,000 members, we imagine these are 12,000 scientists who are addressing these important questions. In fact, these are political organizations, and many of their decisions are based not just upon science, but also dependent upon special interest groups, political factors, economic forces, public relations. There are a lot of factors that go on. Special interest groups within these organizations have a lot of political power.
The decisions and review of research and position statements of the American Psychological Association are written by its Division 44, LGBT division, which automatically excludes people who actually are experts in doing the therapy and doing research on it. It automatically narrows what point of view will be taken.
Confirmation bias is that, you, because of your values or whatever, you are going to be more skeptical of research that isn't consistent with your beliefs and less critical of research that fits with your beliefs, right? And again, that's why there's such a need for diversity of thought and diversity of perspective in this field and in psychology in general, and it's terribly lacking.
When we expressed concerns about that at that time, the president of the AAPA said, well, we can't have someone who doesn't share our worldview. He acknowledged it was based on a worldview that does not represent all members of the American Psychological Association.
I don't know, that seems to me the claim that, you're a religious organization, therefore we can dismiss you, that seems very condescending to me. Science is science, whether you're a faith-based person or not.
Especially in the mainstream and liberal academia, I think it's very hostile to people of faith. I think they're discredited because of their faith, and they're often seen as unscientific. When you get to know people in our community of therapists and those who work in this field of research and science, our values, they inform the way that we practice and the way that we work with our clients. But, we're not doing religious work. We're doing work that we think is inspired by our faith values, but it's scientific. It's mainstream psychological practice. The methods that we use for trauma therapy and other forms of therapy like EMDR and CBT and emotional focused therapy and psychodynamic, these are all mainstream therapeutic techniques used by any other practitioner. It just so happens that our clients have different goals.
The American Psychological Association prides itself on diversity, but when it comes to conservative versus liberal diversity, there is none in the leadership of the American Psychological Association. There's none.
En 1979, Michael McDonald et les Doobie Brothers propulsaient leur succès What a Fool Believes au numéro 1 du palmarès. La chanson est bien connue pour son refrain accrocheur. What a fool believes he sees. No wise man has the power to reason away. Cela rappelle bien pourquoi il est indispensable que dans tout processus de recherche de la vérité, des spécialistes adhérant à une diversité de visions empiriques soient représentés. Ainsi, ce qui devait diriger la sélection des membres du comité de l'APA n'était pas leur adhésion ou non à des croyances religieuses, mais plutôt l'adhésion à une démarche scientifique rigoureuse quant à l'efficacité des thérapies. Cela n'a pas été le cas. Il n'a été constitué que d'hommes et de femmes aux croyances athées, pro-LGBT et ouvertement hostiles aux thérapies de migration.
L'APA a jugé acceptable que des membres experts n'aient pas leur place sur un comité scientifique parce qu'ils croient en Dieu, encourageant implicitement la ségrégation envers ses membres qui sont croyants. Le groupe de travail de l'APA va rapidement disqualifier les études de Spitzer, Jones et Yarhouse en arguant qu'elles ne rencontrent pas des standards de qualité suffisamment élevés pour être considérées. Cela lui permettra de conclure, lors du dépôt de son rapport final, qu'aucune preuve scientifique ne démontre l'efficacité des thérapies. Mais cette tactique ne va pas assez loin. Le lobby craint que s'il s'arrête là, la pratique des thérapies se poursuive et qu'éventuellement, d'autres études avec des méthodologies plus poussées finissent par consacrer leur succès, comme ce fut le cas pour les régimes minceurs. Il doit donc trouver un moyen de diaboliser leur pratique pour de bon, de susciter l'opposition de la population à leur endroit. Une manière d'y arriver serait de statuer qu'elles sont non seulement inefficaces, mais toxiques, que ceux qui les expérimentent, en particulier les enfants, risquent de se suicider. Mais il y a un problème. Aucune étude n'a été faite sur les enfants en thérapie. Celles portant sur les adultes n'ont pas rapporté plus de dommages que dans d'autres domaines de pratique. De plus, ces rapports de dommages sont anecdotiques, c'est-à-dire qu'ils ne sont pas issus d'une démarche scientifique. De plus, ces cas anecdotiques sont liés aux thérapies d'aversion qui ne sont plus pratiquées depuis 30 ans. Qu'à cela ne tienne, qu'elles rencontrent ou non les standards ayant servi à disqualifier les études de Spitzer, Jones et Yarhouse, le groupe de travail va les inclure dans son rapport final. La plus connue d'entre elles étant l'étude de Shidlow et Schroeder.
Shidlow and Schroeder is the famous study completed in 2002 that the APA has used over and over and over and over and over again to tell us that safety is harmful and that it's not effective. This is an exploratory study that has been used to prove cause. It cannot indicate cause, it can't even indicate relationship or even influence. Shidlow and Schroeder recruited using methods that biased the study from the very beginning.
Initially, there were flyers put out in gay venues and things that just said, hey, we want to document like homophobic therapies, and have you experienced harm? Come to us and talk to us.
They advertised that we want to use the results to inform the public about the often harmful effects of such therapies.
Pour mieux saisir à quel point cette étude fut biaisée, il faut rappeler une notion de base en psychothérapie, la règle des 3 tiers. C'est-à-dire qu'environ le tiers des participants d'une thérapie affirment que leur objectif a été atteint. Un second tiers affirme que leur objectif a été atteint partiellement, alors qu'un dernier tiers ne constate aucune amélioration dans leurs conditions. Enfin, il est connu qu'un nombre très faible de participants, environ 5%, rapportent que leur état psychologique s'est détérioré à cause de la thérapie, peu importe le domaine de pratique. Ce que Shidlow et Schroeder ont fait fut de partir à la recherche de ce 5%, en recrutant délibérément dans des milieux pro-gays, dénonçant cette thérapie comme homophobe. Sans surprise, ils ont pu ainsi accumuler un grand nombre de commentaires négatifs. L'étude a ensuite été utilisée pour affirmer qu'une majorité écrasante des participants à une thérapie de migration en ressortait clopés, alors que ce n'est le cas que pour 1 personne sur 20 en réalité, ce qui est comparable aux autres domaines de pratique thérapeutique.
The studies that I think were harmful in that review tended to come from the 60s and 70s, these aversive techniques, these things that aren't done anymore.
So what they found out was what they wanted to find out, not what was reality.
It's when you use that kind of research to say, which isn't no longer really relevant to current modern practices, to say this is harmful. Today's care is harmful as well. Again, I don't think you can generalize the study.
The research shows that the risk for harm is not any different from any other intervention. Very clear in the wonderful longitudinal research done by Jones and Yarhouse.
They never identified this as biasing the results. This wasn't one of their limitations that they discussed in the end.
I tend to think it has a limited value, and all you can really conclude from the study is that, some therapy, some attempts to change could be harmful.
L'étude de Shidlow et Schroeder et celle de Robert Spitzer ont été menées en utilisant la même méthodologie rétrospective. Leurs participants respectifs devaient puiser dans leurs souvenirs pour évaluer le succès de leur thérapie dans un cas et les dommages émotionnels subis dans l'autre. Les fins observateurs noteront que si les militants pro-gays ont été rapides à attaquer les résultats de Spitzer, arguant qu'il était impossible de valider si ses participants avaient menti, ils se sont toutefois bien gardés de dire que l'étude de Shidlow et Schroeder, ayant la même limite, pouvait tout autant produire des résultats biaisés, étant elle aussi dépourvue de moyens pour valider l'honnêteté de ses participants.
En août 2009, le groupe d'études dépose les conclusions que tous avaient vu venir. Il n'existe pas d'études de la rigueur scientifique adéquate prouvant que les thérapies de migration fonctionnent. Certaines personnes ont négativement été affectées par ces dernières. Des approches évitant de changer l'orientation sexuelle devraient plutôt être prises. Le comité ne franchit toutefois pas la ligne de recommander de rendre les thérapies illégales.
The evidence that they use to support treatment change, treatment success, they discount for different reasons, and yet their own flawed material they submitted without question. So it was a very selective procedure, very biased procedure.
Cette attitude anti-scientifique, combinée aux manœuvres d'exclusion injustes ayant marqué la sélection des membres du comité d'études, amèneront un grand nombre d'observateurs de la scène internationale à cesser de considérer l'APA comme une organisation de référence. Autre conséquence, l'organisation verra plusieurs de ses membres quitter le bateau.
People are dropping their membership in APA. APA is shrinking. The income that they used to get from the special assessment is dried up. So the APA is going through some real changes at this point.
Sadly enough, the APA has deviated from science. For example, there's a principle that's called the Leona Tyler Principle. This principle was accepted by the APA and never rescinded. And the principles say that the American Psychological Association would not take a stand on issues for which there was not sufficient evidence and professional experience. That has not been the case.
The presidents in my era abided by the Leona Tyler Principle. All of a sudden, things began to change as things became more political than scientific. The Leona Tyler Principle, which was never withdrawn, disappeared. In fact, you can't even find it in the annals of the APA. If I didn't have it, it wouldn't exist as far as they're concerned.
Many of the resolutions made by the American Psychological Association does not comply with this principle. That is, they make statements and resolutions without the requisite science to support them.
The gay rights movement sort of captured the APA. Yeah, it's very interesting the way it happened. We developed a group of psychologists that numbered around 200 to 250 that rotated themselves through all the offices of the APA. When a rule was passed that you couldn't serve more than X number of sessions on console or on a certain particular office, they would rotate. They would run for another office and then come back to console. So for years, about 200 to 250 people were running the APA.
We believe that they discredit themselves as a source of accurate scientific information.
And they were a very select, inbred group. They were ultra-liberal, and anything that wasn't ultra-liberal was anathema.
A good source of this information is the former president of the American Psychological Association, Dr. Nicholas Cummings, in his book called Destructive Trends in Mental Health.
The book Destructive Trends in Mental Health, and along with a sequel to it called 11 Blunders That Cripple Psychotherapy in America, is getting a lot of attention, both of them. Not in APA. The response to Destructive Trends in Mental Health, The Well-Intentioned Path to Harm, the first response was that Rhea Farberman, the information officer for the APA, immediately sent an email to all of the journals, and the APA owns 28 journals. Most people don't realize that, but 28 journals. Send an instruction to all of the APA journals that this book was not to be reviewed. It's a nice open response, right?
It is sad because they refuse to acknowledge our writings. It's really amazing. They will not review my books. My latest book was positively reviewed by 2 past presidents of the American Psychological Association. And yet the APA Division of Psychoanalysis refused to even review my book.
À partir de la fin des années 80, l'APA, sous l'influence de militants LGBT qui accèdent à sa direction, va se transformer radicalement, devenant un club d'individus très sélects dédié à promouvoir sa vérité, son idéologie et son agenda, l'agenda LGBT quand il est question d'homosexualité. Simultanément, à l'extérieur de l'organisation, le lobby gay continue sa croisade en Occident. Avec la complicité des directions des grands médias qui lui sont désormais sympathiques, on voit apparaître un nouveau type de censure, le jamming.
Qu'est-ce que le jamming? En termes militaires, le jamming, ou le brouillage, vise à empêcher une communication vitale de se rendre dans le camp ennemi. Concrètement, lorsqu'un interlocuteur s'apprête à entrer en communication radio avec l'ennemi pour lui transmettre des informations qui nous seront défavorables, on brouille cette communication en émettant simultanément un signal sur la même fréquence radio. Ce faisant, toute la transmission du camp ennemi est contaminée par de l'interférence. Conséquemment, le destinataire est incapable d'entendre ce que l'émetteur lui transmet. Les médias qui soutiennent les organisations pro-gays utilisent une stratégie similaire. Puisqu'il n'y a pas de controverse autour de l'efficacité des thérapies, mais que ce message nuit à l'atteinte des objectifs du lobby, ils inondent l'Occident de l'information contraire. Ils interfèrent, créant une controverse artificielle qui rend la population confuse en espérant gagner suffisamment de temps pour que les gouvernements rendent les thérapies illégales avant que la bonne manière de les pratiquer n'entre dans les universités et se répande à travers le monde.
À partir des années 90, plusieurs membres de l'APA se rendent compte du manège de l'organisation, en plus de subir la ségrégation croissante qu'elle applique à ses membres qui sont croyants. Ne se reconnaissant plus dans ses valeurs ultralibérales, il voit la nécessité de se joindre à une organisation centrée sur la science. C'est la naissance de NARTH.
NARTH is the National Association for the Research and Therapy of Homosexuality. It's a scientific organization dedicated to upholding the research regarding the issue of homosexuality and defending the rights of clients to seek treatment for unwanted homosexual attractions.
NARTH is a professional scientific organization that provides a response to some of the political stands that the American Psychological Association has taken.
Many of the professional associations are influenced by political correctness and political activism that actually overrides scientific data. And so NARTH was started as an organization that would uphold the research finding and not be motivated by political activism.
Basically, in 1992, Ben Kaufman came to me and said, look, rumor has it that in 1993, the gay activists are going to use the 20th anniversary of the 73 decision to totally ban any kind of treatment. It came on the same day that earlier that day, gay activists had come into my office and spray painted homophobe, Nazi, the gay rainbow over the front door, which, by the way, is not good for business, I can tell you, people coming in.
NARTH, before we even held our first scientific meeting in 1993, if you go to the American Psychiatric Association's publication, the Gay and Lesbian Task Force of the American Psychiatric Association, in the meeting, it was a board of directors meeting, stated, and it's in the minutes, it's available to anybody who wants to look at it. We had not even formed an organization enough to have a meeting yet. It was our first organizational days. They said, NARTH must be isolated. That tells it all.
They've done a very good job of isolating us for 20 years, but they haven't killed us. We're still around for 20 years.
Les efforts de la NARTH pour informer le monde des faits scientifiques entourant les thérapies vont se heurter aux grands médias de masse, généralement gagnés à l'idéologie LGBT, qui pratiquent la désobéissance éthique en jouant à l'autruche, ne servant que de courroie de transmission du lobby gay sur cette question. Bref, le jamming du lobby fait son œuvre, remplaçant les faits scientifiques par de la propagande idéologique.
Well, it's a pretty well-known fact that the liberal, the mainstream media is just an extension of the liberal Democratic Party, but it's also an extension of the LGBT agenda. And that's because of the absolute power that the LGBT lobby has in mainstream society nowadays. In key institutions like the media, you could see organizations like Media Matters and GLAAD have very deep pockets, and they influence and lobby all the major networks and cable TV shows. They have LGBT media awards. They have LGBT journalist associations, big organizations dedicated to promoting LGBT causes. And this is very distressing that we have whole media organizations that are not interested in good objective reporting. They're arms of political causes. And they're infiltrating the media and other key institutions like education and psychology simply to push propaganda.
We are hearing more and more about therapists who are being threatened that their licenses will be removed because they are providing this treatment.
If you go against the LGBT agenda in the mainstream media, you will quickly find yourself unemployed, especially in education and academia. If you don't wholeheartedly support the LGBT affirming agenda, or if you simply offer an alternative to those who are seeking or distressed by unwanted same-sex attractions or gender identity conflicts, you will be pressured, you will be potentially fired, you will be potentially intimidated for those beliefs. And so what it's produced is really a culture of silence and fear.
S'ensuit un effet domino. Plusieurs organisations de santé mentale font siennes les conclusions du groupe d'études de l'APA, que ce soit par ignorance des faits, par crainte de représailles du lobby, par sympathie idéologique avec ce dernier, ou tout simplement parce que leur direction est entre les mains de militants pro-gays.
Au Québec, l'Ordre des psychologues suit le mouvement et publie en 2012 un avis informant ses membres qu'il serait contraire à l'éthique et à la déontologie d'offrir une thérapie de migration. L'organisation prend soin d'appuyer sa position officielle par d'abondants extraits du rapport de l'APA, citant entre autres l'étude biaisée de Shidlow et Schroeder, sans dire un mot sur la constitution biaisée du comité, ni sur la méthodologie douteuse qui a conduit à ses conclusions. Simultanément, des journalistes gays et leurs confrères se lancent dans une chasse aux sorcières, produisant des articles et des reportages à sensation dans lesquels ils qualifient les thérapies de bidons, traitent les thérapeutes qui les offrent de charlatans, le témoignage des ex-gays de discours haineux et les organisations aidant les personnes à sortir de l'homosexualité d'opportunistes ne cherchant qu'à exploiter la détresse de personnes vulnérables. Cela vous rappelle-t-il le traitement réservé jadis au régime minceur avant que les universités ne forment de meilleurs praticiens? Peu importe l'identité du média, la recette demeure la même. On assimile des séances d'exorcisme, d'imposition des mains, d'électrochocs et de torture à des thérapies de migration, alors que cela n'a rien à voir avec la réalité, simplement dans le but de convaincre le public que les thérapies n'utilisent aucune méthode reconnue. Et l'on complète le reportage par le témoignage d'un survivant d'une thérapie qui partage les séquelles qu'il en conservera à vie. Pour couronner le tout, certains de ces reportages se méritent des récompenses et reconnaissances publiques, soulignant leur professionnalisme. Jamais un thérapeute agréé n'est interviewé pour faire connaître le véritable processus d'une thérapie. Jamais on ne fait connaître l'histoire d'un ex-gay pour qui la thérapie a été un succès, alors que le web regorge de sites qui regroupent leurs témoignages.
There's a specific strategy that these organizations and news outlets use. They introduce certain types of stories at certain types of times. It's very common that they'll release a story about a conversion therapy survivor, quote unquote, in January or February, right before the legislative seasons begin on the state level, and this is where all the laws are being considered. They do this by doing what's called a human interest story. And they take someone that supposedly went through conversion therapy and was purportedly harmed by it, often by means of electroshock and some aversion therapy, and then they don't verify any key details like therapist name or dates or when it happened, and they report it as truth. And there's no counterbalance or no counterpoint.
People who oppose reparative therapy equate it with the shock treatment, and they love to make reference to the shock treatment. Well, there was shock treatment for homosexuals in the early 60s, but during the early 60s, there was this trend of using shock therapy not only for homosexuality, but for everything else. All kinds of psychological problems were dealt with this shock therapy.
A very strategic and effective strategy they've used is to use these stories in mass media. And in my book, I document at least 4, 5, 6 ways, legitimate stories and legitimate ways that they've used the media in producing these fictitious stories on programs like ABC's 2020, on different movies that have recently come out on the big screen. They've done many like mini-series, like CBS had a show called Criminal Minds that did a fictitious story. Even Saturday Night Live did a parody of one of these camps. So the indoctrination factor through the media is quite impressive and widespread.
Media outlets don't want to talk about the science behind the issue. They want to talk about what's politically correct. So to try to share this in media, news, TV, radio, any of that, it's just not going to be talked about because it's, there's a lot of complete inaccurate viewing of it. Some people think if you say change is possible, that will lead to more discrimination. I would say not saying change is possible is much more harmful than saying change is possible. There are better ways to deal with the issue of discrimination than to promote lies.
I've done dozens, if not hundreds, of media interviews over the last 10 years. And time after time, the reporters that are assigned to these stories are themselves LGBT identified, and it certainly colors the way that they cover stories. They don't often disclose the fact that they are LGBT identified. They don't tell you that they belong to LGBT activist organizations within the media that have agendas, and they don't tell you their biases. And I believe that is extremely unethical.
L'objectif est à peine voilé. Si le lobby parvient à susciter suffisamment de haine populaire à l'endroit des thérapies et des thérapeutes, il sera plus aisé de faire adopter un projet de loi privant des hommes et des femmes souvent victimes d'abus sexuels durant leur enfance de bénéficier de cette forme d'aide scientifiquement validée. C'est ainsi que d'un bout à l'autre du processus, la population n'y voit que du feu.
La résolution adoptée par la Ville de Montréal pour interdire les thérapies en est un bel exemple. On peut y lire le passage suivant. Attendu que les thérapies qui visent à changer l'orientation sexuelle ou l'identité de genre d'une personne sont cruelles, dépourvues de tout fondement scientifique, dommageables pour la santé mentale et qu'elles briment les droits fondamentaux des personnes qui les suivent, en particulier lorsque ce sont des personnes mineures qui les subissent. Si l'on regarde de plus près ce paragraphe, on relève que chacun de ces segments a fait l'objet d'une désinformation visant à remplacer les faits scientifiques par de la propagande idéologique. Regardons-les un à un. Les thérapies sont-elles vraiment cruelles? Il est vrai qu'à une époque, des thérapies d'aversion et comportementales, utilisées dans plusieurs domaines de pratique incluant l'homosexualité, ont soulevé après coup de sérieuses questions éthiques. Mais ces techniques expérimentales ne sont plus pratiquées depuis des décennies. Elles ont évolué vers des modalités modernes qui sont à la fois éthiques, efficaces et éprouvées empiriquement. Ce parcours évolutif est d'ailleurs commun dans les sciences de la santé et parfois inévitable. Un bel exemple est celui des régimes minceurs que nous avons abordés un peu plus tôt. Faudrait-il condamner les régimes minceurs offerts aujourd'hui, alors qu'ils aident 4 personnes sur 5 à atteindre leurs objectifs, sur la base que certaines méthodes étaient cruelles, voilà 60 ans? Les thérapies sont-elles dépourvues de fondements scientifiques? Les faits récoltés dans notre enquête, synthétisés dans ce documentaire, démontrent le contraire. Il existe 125 ans de rapports cliniques et de recherches empiriques démontrant que lorsque le client est motivé et que son thérapeute est compétent, il peut voir diminuer ses attraits homosexuels au point où il ne représente plus une obsession et voir augmenter ses attraits envers l'autre sexe au point de s'engager dans une relation hétérosexuelle fonctionnelle. Les thérapies sont-elles dommageables pour la santé mentale? L'étude de Shidlow et Schroeder, dont la méthodologie comporte de graves manquements à l'éthique, a rapporté de tels dommages. Mais lors de thérapies d'aversion et comportementales qui remontent à un demi-siècle, est-il nécessaire de répéter que ces techniques ne sont plus pratiquées depuis au moins 30 ans et que les études récentes de Jones et Yarhouse, Nicolosi et Bird, Schaeffer, ainsi que celles de Santero, Whitehead et Ballesteros n'ont pas relevé de dommages émotionnels significatifs? Enfin, les thérapies briment-elles les droits de la personne, en particulier ceux des enfants? Communiquer à une personne les faits scientifiques récents entourant l'efficacité et les limites d'une modalité thérapeutique lui permet de prendre une décision éclairée. Il n'y a donc aucune forme de haine, de discrimination, de violence ni d'injustice faite à l'endroit de cette personne. En revanche, lui cacher l'information qu'elle peut être libérée de ses attraits envers le même sexe, alors qu'elle confirme souffrir dans cette condition et démontre de la motivation pour en sortir, est une injustice. C'est lui faire violence. De nombreux témoignages d'ex-gays confirment que ceux à qui l'on a caché cette option pour les diriger vers des thérapies de persuasion où on les forçait à embrasser leur homosexualité contre leur gré ont fait l'expérience d'une plus grande détresse, ont eu des idées suicidaires et ont tenté de mettre fin à leur jour. Ce qui est éthique n'est pas d'imposer à la personne une conduite qui servira notre cause, mais bien de lui faire connaître ses choix en l'éclairant de différents points de vue et de la laisser exercer son droit à l'autodétermination. Ce qui brime les droits de la personne n'est pas d'offrir une thérapie scientifiquement validée qu'elle recherche désespérément, mais de rendre cette thérapie criminelle, privant ainsi la personne de la possibilité d'en bénéficier. En termes philosophiques, cela s'appelle de l'opportunisme. Manipuler les faits, tirer profit des circonstances, en particulier de l'ignorance de la population, afin de faire avancer son agenda à son insu. Dans les 4 segments de ce paragraphe, les rédacteurs ont donc minutieusement choisi leurs mots pour manipuler la population de Montréal. Ils ont manœuvré pour susciter sa haine à l'endroit des thérapies, des thérapeutes et des organisations qui les soutiennent, afin que la ville atteigne son objectif de bannir les thérapies sans que la population ne s'y oppose.
Cette stratégie n'est pas nouvelle. Elle a d'abord été expérimentée aux États-Unis. Là-bas, à partir de 2012, des projets de loi visant à bannir les thérapies de migration sont successivement déposés dans 32 États. 11 d'entre eux les rejetteront après un examen minutieux de la déficience des preuves fournies. Toutefois, 20 États sous des gouvernements libéraux, comme celui du Canada, iront de l'avant et vont les bannir, à la suite de commissions d'enquête à l'objectivité douteuse.
I witnessed a lot of fraud. Unfortunately, there are a lot of, I believe, well-meaning LGBT activists that really believe in their cause, that believe therapy is harmful. But I think that some of those LGBT activists are not emotionally and mentally healthy. And I believe that some of them are actually committing fraud when they tell these stories of therapy, torture, and electric shock, and all kind of aversion types of therapy. There's really no facts to back up those stories. They don't provide dates of when they went to therapy, who the therapist's name was, where they got the therapy. Very key, important details that one would expect could produce if such stories were actually true. And without those facts, it's very hard to take their stories as credible.
Après toute cette censure entourant l'efficacité des thérapies de migration, les chasses aux sorcières dans les médias pour faire passer les thérapeutes pour des charlatans, les journalistes qui militent pour l'idéologie LGBT mais qui le cachent au public, les commissions d'enquête biaisées pour bannir les thérapies dans des États américains libéraux, les chercheurs qui ne trouvent plus de financement pour réaliser de nouvelles études, ni d'éditeurs pour publier leur ouvrage, s'ajoute finalement la censure d'Amazon.
Au beau milieu de 2018, le géant de la distribution en ligne retire unilatéralement de son répertoire tous les ouvrages du Dr Nicolosi suite à une campagne de salissage du lobby gay. Un pas de plus est malheureusement franchi pour empêcher les thérapeutes cherchant à se former à cette pratique d'obtenir des manuels de formation. Entre-temps, l'APA mesure les conséquences de sa désobéissance éthique en constatant l'exode massif de ses membres. Elle confie alors à Lisa Diamond, la spécialiste des recherches sur la fluidité sexuelle, la préparation d'un nouvel ouvrage plus rigoureux dans le but de se repositionner sur cette question et de réparer les pots cassés. Le APA Handbook of Sexuality and Psychology paraît en 2014 et confirme qu'il est bel et bien possible de changer d'orientation sexuelle.
The APA Handbook reviews one of the most rigorous studies of sexual identity change in America that followed sexual identity of young adult participants when most were ages 18 through 24 and again about 6 years later. 43% of non-heterosexual men and 50% of non-heterosexual women had any change after 6 years. 66% of men and 66% of women who had any change changed to exclusively heterosexual. 75% of bisexuals experienced change mostly toward or to heterosexual. 8% of exclusively homosexual men and 26% of lesbians experienced change. 8% of exclusively heterosexual men and 11% of exclusively heterosexual women experienced a change. And the heterosexuals who changed mostly to mostly heterosexual. Heterosexuals are the most stable cross-culturally. Statements in the APA Handbook say that attraction, behavior, and identity, all three, change for adolescents and adults. Research on sexual minorities has long documented that many recall having undergone notable shifts in their patterns of sexual attractions, behaviors, or orientation identities over time. Although change in adolescence and emerging adulthood is understandable, change in adulthood contradicts the prevailing view of consistency in sexual orientation, Rosario and Shrimshaw. Over the course of life, individuals experience the following changes or fluctuations in sexual attractions, behaviors, and romantic partnerships, Mistansky, Cooper, and Green. So we have a lot of reputable, well-respected researchers in same-sex sexuality saying the same thing here in the APA Handbook. Diamond and Roski concluded from their research review, several such studies have now been completed and they unequivocally demonstrate that same-sex and other sex attractions do change over time in some individuals. Across several rigorous studies, among those who changed, 50 to 100% changed to exclusive heterosexuality. Most of mostly heterosexual individuals, along with others, also changed to heterosexual. They concluded that rates of change do not appear to decline as participants get older. The series preface to the APA Handbook of Sexuality and Psychology says that the American Psychological Association gave its imprimatur to the handbook, said that its editors and authors were among its most respected members and declared it authoritative. So there's no question the American Psychological Association considers its APA Handbook of Sexuality and Psychology authoritative.
Alors que l'APA se repositionne dans son Handbook of Sexuality and Psychology, la même année, NART modernise son nom, devenant The Alliance for Therapeutic Choice and Scientific Integrity. Alors que certains espèrent une réconciliation des positions des deux organisations sur les thérapies, l'impasse demeure entière. En effet, Diamond, qui est membre de la communauté LGBT à titre de lesbienne, refuse d'accréditer les thérapies, martelant que si les sujets qu'elle a étudiés ont effectivement changé d'orientation sexuelle, le processus qu'ils ont traversé s'est fait hors de leur contrôle, les désarçonnant parfois au point où certains tentaient d'y résister. Bref, que si la fluidité de l'orientation sexuelle est un fait bien réel, elle échappe au contrôle de la volonté et ne peut survenir dans le cadre d'une thérapie.
Well, how can someone say sexual fluidity occurs through life experience, except that intense life experience known as therapy? That the minute the person enters the office of a therapist, their fluidity stops and cannot occur, and the minute they leave, it can resume again. It just makes no sense.
It is true that we need more research on this, but it seems to me to kind of defy logic to say that sexual attraction fluidity can occur anywhere naturalistically. The only place it cannot occur is in the therapist's office.
I'm a clinician. I teach at a medical school as well. And I can tell you that from the lives of people that I've worked with over the last 4 decades, that they've made remarkable changes in their lives, and that homosexuality is not something that's fixed in all people.
Diamond and Roski summarized the findings of their research review on same-sex sexuality this way. Arguments based on the immutability or unchangeability of sexual orientation are unscientific. Advocates for sexual minorities have argued that sexual orientation is a fixed, biologically based trait that cannot be chosen or changed. We hope our review of scientific findings and legal rulings regarding immutability will deal these arguments a final and fatal blow.
En 2018, la plus récente étude sur le sujet des thérapies, réalisée par Santero, Whitehead et Ballesteros, est publiée. Mais à bout de bras, 7 longues années après avoir été complétée, à cause de difficultés à trouver une revue scientifique intéressée à la publier. L'étude de bonne qualité produit des résultats similaires à celles de Jones et Yarhouse. Les clients en thérapie font l'expérience de changements réels. Il y a peu de dommages à la santé mentale et beaucoup de commentaires positifs. Les résultats démontrent que les participants répondent aussi bien à cette pratique thérapeutique qu'à d'autres qui ont fait leurs preuves. À nouveau, ces résultats pointent 180 degrés dans le sens contraire des conclusions du groupe d'études de l'APA.
Quelques mois après sa publication, un changement de direction survient à la tête du Lineker Quarterly et le nouvel éditeur en chef, sans doute apeuré par le potentiel de controverse entourant les conclusions de la recherche, décide de retirer l'étude de la revue scientifique tout en privant les auteurs de la permission de la publier ailleurs. Cela synthétise bien l'obstruction à laquelle les hommes et les femmes de bonne volonté doivent s'attendre à rencontrer lorsqu'ils s'investissent dans la promotion des faits scientifiques entourant les thérapies.
Par ailleurs, en décembre 2018, un article du Journal de Montréal annonce que la ministre de la Justice du Québec s'apprête à consulter des groupes pro-gays sur l'opportunité d'interdire dans la province les thérapies de migration. Nous ferons une démarche dans le but d'être reçus par la ministre afin de lui partager les fruits de notre enquête journalistique. Notre tentative de lui parler sera répondue 2 semaines plus tard par un refus de nous recevoir. 15 mois plus tard, le gouvernement libéral du Canada dépose un projet de loi qu'il présente à la population comme le plus progressiste au monde, visant à criminaliser à la fois la pratique des thérapies auprès des jeunes et les organisations qui les font connaître. C'est le dernier événement dont nous serons témoins avant de compléter ce documentaire.
Recovery became fun. I wasn't trying to, on purpose, get attracted to girls. It was about finding the buddies and how do I make best friends and how do I never learned how to play baseball. I think I want to try that without having a panic attack. And it became fun. It wasn't shock therapy. It wasn't somebody trying to tell me, think more about girls and masturbate about them. It wasn't some crazy thing. It was, be who you are. Let guys love on you. Find how to get those healthy guys in your life. I remember my mom saying to me, your dad might not ever be able to be what you need him to be. You're going to need to find some other dads who can love you.
My homosexual attractions diminished in frequency and intensity as a result of developing healthy same-sex friendships and also counseling, went to therapy, dealing with sexual abuse issues, because that will affect your ability to love and trust. There's other issues, that homosexuality is just a surface symptom. So it's like we got to get underneath there and deal with what's going on. How do I feel about my gender? Why do I feel like being a woman is a liability?
It was fun though. You get into it and it's like, I could do this forever. I had another friend and we were doing it and I told him one time, I said, I feel like I'm in puberty again, Get to go out and play ball and get to do all these things I always wanted to do without the shame and the isolation and the loneliness. I felt connected for the first time in my life.
Après quelques années en thérapie, John et Christine ont chacun atteint leur objectif. Leurs attraits envers le même sexe, qui jadis les obsédaient, ont diminué à un niveau ne représentant plus un problème. De plus, la thérapie leur a permis d'acquérir des outils efficaces pour reconnaître les circonstances où ils sont vulnérables de les voir réapparaître et pour les désamorcer le cas échéant. Alors que le lobby gay leur avait prédit un échec complet, leur démarche se conclut plutôt par un plus grand bien-être que jamais dans leur identité sexuelle.
Notre enquête journalistique nous dirige vers 17 constats importants. Il y a bel et bien des individus qui réussissent à migrer de l'homosexualité vers l'hétérosexualité. Loin d'être une exception, ils représentent environ le tiers de ceux qui rencontrent un thérapeute compétent. Les changements qu'ils expérimentent ne sont pas momentanés, mais durables pour la plupart. Beaucoup ne se considèrent pas nés homosexuels, mais attribuent leurs attraits à de l'abus sexuel vécu durant leur enfance. Plusieurs thérapeutes ne les accompagnent pas convenablement, n'ayant pas été formés adéquatement. Conséquemment, il y a des clients qui ressortent déçus de leur expérience. Des thérapeutes n'ont pas reçu de formations adéquates pour les aider, car les universités refusent de les fournir. Elles refusent de les fournir par sympathie idéologique avec le lobby gay ou par crainte de subir des représailles. Elles craignent des représailles parce que le lobby utilise l'intimidation et les campagnes de salissage contre ceux qui questionnent l'idéologie. L'intimidation et les campagnes de salissage sont utilisées par le lobby avec la bénédiction des gouvernements. Les médias libéraux agissent comme complices, encourageant des reporters à désinformer la population sur le sujet. Cette désinformation fonctionne, suscitant le mépris envers quiconque affirme que l'orientation sexuelle peut fluctuer. Cela engendre une omerta, une culture de peur et de silence qui brime la liberté d'expression des Canadiens. C'est la raison pour laquelle les bailleurs de fonds n'osent plus subventionner des recherches sur l'efficacité des thérapies, les revues scientifiques n'osent plus publier les résultats d'études qui contredisent la propagande LGBT, des librairies n'osent plus distribuer des ouvrages scientifiques défavorables au lobby, des thérapeutes compétents se cachent, étant pourchassés dans les médias et victimes de la haine populaire, et des personnes abusées sexuellement durant leur enfance, ayant légitimement le droit de recevoir cette aide, sont menacées d'en être privées. De ces observations découlent 5 recommandations. Comme ce fut le cas pour les régimes minceurs, les gouvernements devraient favoriser la recherche scientifique afin d'identifier les approches les plus efficaces. Ils devraient forcer les thérapeutes désirant aider cette clientèle à être formés sur ces modalités. Ils devraient multiplier les lieux où cette formation est donnée, en particulier les universités d'État. Ils devraient encourager les initiatives personnelles visant à faire connaître ces lieux de formation, ainsi que l'identité des thérapeutes ayant déjà la compétence pour aider cette clientèle. Ils devraient enfin inclure les ex-gays parmi les minorités protégées contre toute forme de haine et de discriminations injustes.
And so over time, as I did that, was dating my wife. That's another story. We have our ups and downs there. She's very patient. She knew before we got married about the struggle. And as my heterosexual feelings started to grow, not because I was forcing them, they were just coming up. We started to date more intensely and got married. And we just have been married 19 years now, renewed our vows a year and a half ago, and we have 3 kids. So.
En mars 2020, suite à la censure d'Amazon, Joseph Nicolosi Jr., également psychologue, a mis sur pied un service de formation en ligne destiné aux thérapeutes désirant apprendre les bases de la thérapie réintégrative. Il poursuit ainsi l'œuvre entamée par son père 25 ans plus tôt, visant à former une nouvelle génération de thérapeutes avec l'une des approches les plus efficaces dans ce domaine de pratique. Les résultats d'une nouvelle étude sur l'efficacité des thérapies doivent paraître d'ici 2021. Elle a été conduite par Caroline Pilla et Joseph Nicolosi avant le décès de ce dernier en 2017. Les résultats préliminaires s'harmonisent aux conclusions des grandes études que nous avons abordées dans ce documentaire. On peut toutefois s'attendre à ce que leurs auteurs aient de la difficulté à publier leurs résultats dans une revue non religieuse, que les détracteurs des thérapies s'empressent de salir leur réputation et de discréditer les résultats, que leur ordre les menace de retirer leurs droits de pratique, que des courriels haineux leur soient transmis par des militants pro-gays, puis qu'aucun média de masse n'en fasse mention dans leurs manchettes. Chez nous, ces hommes et ces femmes qui sacrifient leur réputation pour aider les personnes aux prises avec des attraits homosexuels non désirés ne recevront certes jamais l'Ordre du Canada. Cet honneur a beau être conféré à des individus en reconnaissance de leur réalisation exceptionnelle, de leur dévouement remarquable envers une communauté, leur audace et leur passion ont beau incarner la devise de l'Ordre, ils ne recevront jamais cet honneur. Ils ont malheureusement choisi la mauvaise cause. Cela porte à réfléchir. Dans les pays totalitaires, il est permis de parler de tous les sujets, sauf de critiquer le régime au pouvoir. Ceux qui s'y adonnent risquent l'emprisonnement et toute une gamme de représailles personnelles et familiales. De même, ici au Canada, on peut parler librement de tous les sujets, sauf remettre en question le discours idéologique LGBT. Si quelqu'un ose publiquement questionner l'idéologie obligatoire imposée au peuple, sa réputation et sa carrière seront rapidement réduites en ruine par les médias, avec la bénédiction de nos élus. Cette police de la pensée qui censure les faits scientifiques entourant les thérapies de migration et qui salit la réputation des hommes et des femmes qui aident les personnes homosexuelles, est-elle vraiment un progrès dans notre société? N'est-elle pas plutôt une erreur de parcours que l'on devrait se dépêcher de corriger avant que les historiens nous la remettent sur le nez pour les siècles à venir? Ici Michel Lizotte. Au revoir.